morning from the frozen north here. It's Wallace with Warphammer and Mike.
Mike Bestels.
And today we're meeting with a well-known figure in the design space, Mr. Andy Chambers.
Hi there. Great pleasure to be with you today in the frozen north. Watch out for bears. And wolves, as I understand it, up there too.
And moose. And moose.
And moose. Probably more dangerous, actually, than either of the above. The moose.
Yeah, and they will just wander around, so... And today we're just being graced enough to talk a little bit about the design perspectives and the life of Mr. Andy Chambers. And so to kick things off, I just wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your early life. Specifically, what kind of media did you enjoy growing up?
When I was young, there weren't that many kinds overall. I was born and raised in Nottingham, where I still live to this day, after a bit of a jaunt to other shores for a while. When I was young, I was a sickly kid, still am to a certain extent, asthmatic and stuff like that. So like most sickly kids, I got into reading a lot. I also got into gaming, though, via my brother's friends actually got into like Airfix kits and playing games with the Airfix rules sets that you could get back then. They used to publish stuff for their 1/72 scale. So World War II tanks and stuff like that, and plastic army men, which I've been into since I was before games, just and firing matchstick cannons at each other and stuff like that. Well, each other's armies. And that kind of grew into, let me see, at that point, we're talking 70s. Fantasy and science fiction was kind of around, much like the movie scene was kind of around, but it wasn't particularly big. It was very sort of specialist. But towards my sort of like early teens, D&D arrived on the scene, and fantasy and sci-fi became a lot more mainstream at that point. People started making more miniatures for them and stuff like that. And miniatures gaming, I loved sci-fi in particular. I like fantasy a lot as well, from that background in reading. Lord of the Rings and so on. And some of my earliest game was all Lord of the Rings games. Laying siege to Minas Morgul and stuff like that. As represented by the Airfix Fort Sahara painted black. Because we had to improvise a lot back then too, because I say there wasn't much available. But things, as I got into my late teens, started to develop quite rapidly. Games Workshop became a force down in London at the time, because they had an agreement to be the exclusive distributor in the UK for D&D for the first 3 years it was around. So they grew a lot off the back of that. Started making their own games as well. And that's the very sort of like germ, the seed of Games Workshop as you see it today. Came from Games Workshop, and eventually they did a deal where they joined it with Citadel Miniatures up here in Nottingham, and they moved the whole operation up to Nottingham. I was unaware of all this. I was hanging out by this point with Asgard Miniatures, which was another little fantasy sci-fi company producing metal miniatures in Nottingham, in the heart of Nottingham, and they had a little games club, and got really into lots of different fantasy games, played a lot of D&D, a lot of really dreadful fantasy rules sets and things like that. And I kind of grew to hate, if I'm honest, a lot of the war games rules that were around in that period of time, because they'd come from a very simulationist sort of an approach, because it was serious business, it's not playing with toy soldiers, it's a serious game, and we're recreating history here. And it meant that the rules, especially as a kid, were just interminable and really opaque and hard to learn. So only a handful of people actually understood the games and so on, and nothing much had tended to happen in them a lot of the time, etc., etc. Fast forward a little bit, and I picked up on Games Workshop stuff. Worked there a little bit in mail order, but was really kind of struck with how fun the games were. They were designed to be easy to pick up. They were supplied, which you take it for granted now, but it wasn't this way back in the day. That whole game in a box idea, where you've got everything you need, all the templates, all the markers, the miniatures, some terrain even. They didn't used to exist before that. They might have done, to be fair, but they certainly didn't come past my nose. And I'd got into Adeptus Titanicus, and off the back of that, being into Adeptus Titanicus, I eventually wrote an article for White Dwarf, and they accepted me in to work on that and do more work at the studio, and that was my start in 1990. Yes. Towards the end of the last century, I joined Games Workshop at their studio in Nottingham, Enfield Chambers, as it was back then, where I re-encountered some people I knew from Asgard, because Jess Goodwin, for example, used to sculpt for Asgard Miniatures, and I knew him from there, and he was working with Citadel by that time. Still there to this day. And, the heart of a lot of the great design you see in Games Workshop products. So that was my start from kind of being a youth. And there was education involved as well, and, I never actually went to university or anything like that. I did like what they call a higher national diploma here. So I don't know what the equivalent is. High school. I finished high school, but I never went to college.
When did you decide you were going to jump into game design? Because it had to have been a big moment for you when you first heard back from GW after writing an article for White Dwarf.
Yeah.
I'd been kind of doing it for myself for a long time at that point. I mean, I mentioned playing Lord of the Rings games when I was younger, and I mean, I'm talking like 11. And we were playing Southeastern London War Games Middle Earth rules, which were written by a War Games club in London. And they were kind of, they came from that very historical basis. They were all factors and tables and stuff like that. But I'd got my head around that, and we used to play games with it. But I also produced additional material for it myself, and did stuff for ships and things like that. We had a whole naval combat game where we cut triremes out of cereal packets and stuff like that. So I'd already come up with supplemental rules for things ever since I was really young, and I'd had a go at writing a set of rules in my 20s. Yeah, about 1920, which were kind of like an agglomeration of things I liked from other sets of rules. So I was fairly comfortable with it. And when I wrote the article that kind of got me started with Games Workshop, it was from the fact that they'd produced what are called Knights now. One-man Titans is what they were called back then, but there weren't any rules for them. And usually GW was really good about putting rules in White Dwarf or something for everything that came out. It was kind of their shtick.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, that's weird. And I heard, because I still knew people who'd worked at mail order and then moved to working at the studio, that Jervis Johnson, who was the guy who wrote all the Adeptus Titanicus stuff because he designed the game, was on sabbatical for 6 months. And that's why they hadn't written any rules for Knights, because there was nobody to do it. And I was like, okay, I can do that. I can write some rules. I've done it loads of times before, and I knew Adeptus Titanicus really well because I played it all the time. So I was just like, bish bosh, bish bosh. And I made a point to write an article like it would be a White Dwarf article. So I did little quotes and things like that, which I think is what they were taken with. Is like I took the time not only to write something for it, but to make it in the format that they were used to. And we're like, oh, all right, this guy's got some nouts about him. So more luck than judgment, really. It's just the way I did it, because I'd been doing it for a long time, sort of like slotting in extra rules to other game systems one way or another. So there wasn't really a conscious sort of like, I am going to move into games design. It had never been a career plan or anything like that. I mean, I trained, if you want to call it that, in graphic design and art and English. And though, funnily enough, I scored best at English out of all of those. So that was perhaps fate trying to tell me something.
So it's kind of a natural progression from home brewing some stuff to kind of getting noticed for the quality of it. That's interesting.
And that's what I tell people today when they're sort of like, oh, how do I get a start? And I said, usually just start, do stuff for yourself, for your own entertainment, do it for your circle of friends. I mean, these days with the internet, with connectivity, it's very easy to find a group of people who are interested in similar things. So get in there and do it, and don't be afraid of it. It's easy to think that games design is some kind of like high science, but it's not. It's really not. It's far more art than science, in my opinion. There are techniques you can use and so forth, but it's all about the feel.
So Warhammer was a pretty good chunk of the first portion of your career. And I just had a question of what is one thing you wish you could tell yourself now or about then that you know now?
Something I can tell myself then that I know now.
Yes.
I
If you were
assume you
talking
mean.
young Andy.
Yes.
Young
I
Andy.
can go back and talk to young Andy now.
Yep.
Oh, there's so many different potential responses to that. I mean, at a very simple level, there's like, go back to Andy when he was working on a second edition 40k, 1993. This is, I think, no, it'd be 92 or something like that. And say, don't put the virus card in, because that was my first encounter with doing something where it had kind of blowback in the game itself that you were working on. There was so little kind of like feedback immediately available back then, you know, because people would literally have to like write you a letter and send it snail mail, and then you receive it and read it, and that was how you got feedback about how your game was doing, other than a few vague rumors from the retail chain. So something like, oh hell, we included a card in the game that ruins games, seemed like a fun idea at the time. No, not really. It was an important lesson. It was an important lesson in itself. Also, the response to it was an important lesson of like, do you listen to people and respond, or do you just go, it's fine, you know?
So for
no
those of us that are uneducated.
Sorry, yeah, I'm assuming everybody knows about the virus card. Right, when we did 40k second edition, it was basically bringing together lots of stuff that had been done for the original Rogue Trader game and its supplemental books that had come out over a number of years that were like White Dwarf Holocaust. There was all sorts of stuff had been done for it. And basically we dragged it all together to try and make it into more of a tabletop battle game, because it was very role-play Rogue Trader days, and there wasn't a lot of guidance about how to put together games. And what feedback we got at that point about 40k was actually people want to be able to line up and fight. You know, you need to give them more guidance about how to do that, not go, oh, here's a giant army list and, you know, no guidance at all about what may even be vaguely balanced within it, or why you shouldn't show up with, you know, 15 Space Marines all armed with las cannons or indeed virus grenades. Because there were a number of wiki weapons that were in Rogue Trader, things like vortex grenades, virus grenades, rad bombs, which you could take as like rad missiles with a 20-inch diameter blast and things like that. It was all there in the rules because it was a role-playing approach to things where, you know, these are the things that you might want to play with in your games. And we had to kind of like restrict them down a little bit. But the things doing that, if you remove all of those things, it takes a lot of the flavor away as well. So we didn't want to take all the flavor away. The compromise position for 40k that I came up with was something that had already been done in Warhammer, which was taking them and putting them on cards. In Warhammer, it had been magic items, you know, the sword that sucks souls or what have you, the black orb. For 40k, the equivalent was kind of these war gear items, these wacky things that you wanted to have some around that were flavorful, but not too many of them. Things like refractor fields, vortex grenades, and so on. So you had them on cards. You could only have, you know, as many as you had cards, so one in most cases, and they had a cost. And you could say only these models can have war gear cards, blah blah. You could even say you can restrict how much value of a card they could have, and say, you know, oh, vortex grenade is 50 points. This character can only have 25 points worth of war gear. So it was an extra lever to pull in controlling the excesses while still keeping some of them in play. And vortex grenades were still an issue, but they were kind of more of a fun issue than a dreadful issue. One of the things that didn't fit very well into that system, sorry, this is a really roundabout way of getting to it, was the virus bomb. Because the virus bomb had this ability where it would affect an area. Okay, if people got affected by it, they could then infect other people close by, so it could spread. Okay, interesting idea. You might begin to imagine the exponential problems you can get from that. But we still had it in as like a random event card, basically, that there was a virus, either an old virus on the battlefield that got reenacted or whatever, that basically a virus went off. So we could still have that effect because it was kind of a fun effect. But certain armies would run up against it, you know, like Orcs or Imperial Guard, and it just take out virtually all of their army or a big chunk of it, you know, just without anything happening other than their opponent going like, oh, virus grenade. So Yeah, it was bad. It was bad. And hilariously bad in some ways because okay, we'll play again now, but it was something where we heard the yells about that all the way back in Nottingham, sort of thing. So we went to had to put a little article in White Dwarf. And it was also kind of a start of something we started to do regularly in White Dwarf, where we did chapter approved, which was in effect FAQs and tweaks to the game as you went along to try and keep these things a bit under control. And the advice in that was to tear up your virus card and don't use it anymore.
Yeah. Andy, I do have a question kind of playing off that, because when you make a game and it sounds like you're willing to take a lot of risks, there's always a chance that there can be something unbalanced appearing in the game.
Yes.
What's kind of your attitude towards kind of balancing that between like willing to take risks? Like, do you think it's on the players that they discover something to not maybe take advantage of something that seems very good, or is that on the game design?
No.
What's your general?
You put it there in the first place. It's ultimately your fault. It's really what it comes down to, and people will examine the game and they'll look to find things to exploit, and you have to go in with your eyes open about that. At the same time, I mean, you can design a game that restricts all of it. Chess is a fantastic example. Checkers, even better. Go is an even better example of games where you can restrict choice down to a literal binary 0 and 1, yes, no sort of thing, and still make a game out of it, and a perfect game, many people would argue, to this day. So you don't have to have these things in there. You choose to have them in there for fun, because games should also be fun. And where that dial sits, to a certain extent, depends on the game. It depends on your audience and how they feel about it. And it depends on you as a designer, and like how much fun do you want to have with your game's design. It comes with risk. Yes, you can put things in there inadvertently that just, even with playtesting, they don't show up until it gets there out into the wild. Because that's the other thing, that the bottled version you have that you playtest and you learn from with your friends and your colleagues, and even if you send it to a larger group, is nothing compared to what happens once it gets there into the wild, and it goes all Jurassic Park on you, basically. Like, but they're all female. How could they possibly procreate? Well, they did. Life will find a way. And that happens to wargames rules all the time. It really does. They have a shelf life. And you can kind of tell how good a job you did, how long it takes them to find the dreadful exploit that will ruin the game. You can usually measure it in months. Sometimes it's years. And of course, every time you put supplemental stuff out there as well, you're rolling those same dice to a certain extent. That being said, the other thing I tend to say about games design, you're in control of the horizontal and the vertical. It's the old Twilight Zone episodes. You control everything. So these are all your choices. You don't get forced to do this. You choose to. So you have to do it in a conscious fashion of like, well, maybe that will, get out of hand. And you kind of put your cane toads into the system as well to stop things getting out of hand. And I don't know. I can't.
There's
really
a fine balance.
There is a fine balance. It's a fine line that you're walking between having something that's totally locked down, totally boring, with no discovery possible in it, and having something that's wild and wacky. And actually, players are happier on either side of that equation. Different players will be happier on different sides of the equation, and you're trying to find a meeting point in the middle between people who do want to sort of like find out, okay, you've given me a set of parameters. What's the best I can do within this? What's the most crushy army I can create in this? Some people love doing that. Some people love taking two crushy armies and smashing them against each other to find out who's right and who is dead, sort of thing. And that's perfectly valid. And you can't hate on them for doing that with your game. That was what you created the game for. You gave them points values. You gave them the tools to do this with. Don't blame them when they use them to go smashy on each other, because that's what the game's designed for. Well, that kind of a game, to be fair. I'm talking about, your classic tabletop miniatures, 40K or what have you, which I had 14 years working on, so it tends to shape my thinking a lot when it comes to tabletop games. But on the other hand, you have that original Rogue Trader. Where it is more of it's a role-playing experience. We're sharing this experience. You pick your force that's all characterful, and fits a theme and so forth. I pick my force the same. Maybe we have a GM that's actually running us through a scenario, and there's third parties involved, and all this sort of thing. Both sets of players are playing with the same game rules and playing the same game to a large extent, but what they want out of it, what they're looking for out of it, are different. As a games designer, if you're a good games designer, you cover both, so that both of them can find things that they love, because then they can play each other as well, which can sometimes be a bit of a bruising experience, but it can be good as well. They can have a lot of fun. Try and view your hobby as a whole thing, rather than these are the important people, these are the tournament players, these are the ones who view it seriously, so we should always listen to them. It's it's finding a balance. It really is that sort of narrow line between the two of them, because competitive play will strangle a game over time if you let it. So you're always dealing with a bit of a moving target on that front as well.
So that's about what you would remove from the game. But going to second edition,
oh yeah,
I gotta say,
that was all about what would you remove?
well, there was a lot of ideas in there. One of the things I'm curious about is going back to the second edition books and looking through it. It's really dense, and it's really more of an experience. Like interlaid in all the pages is the Blanchera artwork. You have a lot of conversion models in the book, because there's no model for that unit yet. But there's a lot of stories, there's lore, there's language interlaid with the pages. It's very interesting, and it's very different looking than what like a modern cleaned up codex looks like. But a lot of people love that, and they liked that kind of era of design for Warhammer. It did feel like dense, like you were going in it for an experience, not just flipping to the back of the book and looking at the last 5 pages of rules. And one thing I had a question about, is there anything you wanted to add, if you could go back, that you would have liked to, knowing what you know from all of this experience you have designing now, that you'd want to go back?
Second edition.
Yeah, about 40K second edition.
Yeah. A proper campaign system. That's the thing it really lacked at the time, which we kind of came to understand later, but never really managed to tackle it, except in, funnily enough, spin-off games like Necromunda, where we put proper campaign systems into them, but we never did it for the core game. That's the thing that I think was to a certain extent a missed opportunity, because campaigns are really cool. Yeah. They're a great way to have a succession of different games with a slightly different flavour in them and so forth, and keep people engaged over multiple games as well. And I don't know, we kind of didn't really quite have the knowledge base. I certainly didn't at the time, because it was very early on in my career that I did second edition 40K. I'd only been at Games Workshop for a few years at that point, and I had the good fortune that I worked with Jervis Johnson, who was far more of a kind of veteran games designer. And I had Rick Priestley as my ultimate boss, who'd done a lot of games design as well. But boots on the ground, me doing it, it was just, I don't know. There was a big enough stack of things, to be fair, in rendering all of the Rogue Trader books into like a coherent core system, that I just didn't have time really to think about it, and my brain wasn't working that way. The reason I bring up Jervis, though, is because his work on Blood Bowl and his work with me on Necromunda subsequent to that kind of like showed us how to do good campaigns. And gave some good tools for doing that kind of thing. So it's kind of just missed the opportunity. But yeah, if I had my time again, it would definitely go into putting more of a campaign system into place for 40K second edition, because it was a very skirmishy game. It would really suit it. I mean, when we did things like Necromunda, it was basically taking 40K second edition and going like, well, here's second edition 40K with a campaign system, and some different stylings to put it in a hive.
Yeah. Kind of the parallel I see in talking about that, like everything was so interlaid into the flavor of the game in that era. There's kind of a marriage between the narrative that you're creating and the rules that are represented for the characters, for the models, for the play experience. Do you feel like there was an interplay there between rules and the flavor design? Or was it really like you're taking the story and you're trying to figure out a way to represent that on a tabletop?
It was mostly miniature led, in that the miniature designers would, do their concepts and do miniatures, not necessarily with a great deal of reference to what the rules writers were talking about doing. So occasionally we get things where the Razorback is always the example I bring up for this one. Razorbacks. It's a Rhino APC with a turret on the back, and these days a variety of different weapons. When the first one showed up, like metal parts to add onto a plastic Rhino kit, it was a las cannon twin-linked plasma guns on top of it, which was just like the most bizarre selection of, two plasma guns. We invented the term twin-linked about that time to cover things like that, because it was just this bizarre, like, why would you make something like this? Can I not have a heavy bolter or something? So yeah, you get stuff like that come up. But at the same time, right from when I started at Enfield Chambers in 1990, we were pretty good about talking to each other about what we were doing, talking about ideas. And when I say that, I mean sitting there having a long conversation with Jez about Eldar and what the Eldar background would be like and things like that. William King, who was an author with actual writing capability, was around when I started. So I learned a lot off him about writing. And of course, his approach, because he ended up writing like army books and things like that, which wasn't his speciality. Writing stories and characters and so forth was. So we kind of like merged skills to a certain extent on the rules side and the technical side, the narrative, the writing side, and the creative miniature design side. Formed a little triangle of different skills and interacted with each other a lot, which is still my ideal. I think that's how it works best, personally. A lot of studios these days go with a kind of very siloed system where miniature designers don't talk to rules writers, rules writers don't talk to story guys and things like that. They just each do their bit. I think that's dreadful, personally. It's very much a missed opportunity to I don't know, get a kind of unified approach, which is perhaps what you're seeing in second edition, 40k in particular, of the different bits all working together.
I think that interplay is really important, especially for the game, and it's part of what created a lot of the flavor that got people involved. Speaking on it, like that, just as that example, that second edition Chaos Codex was really the first flushed out explanation of like what Chaos Space Marine were. There wasn't the Horus Heresies at that time.
Well, there was technically, but it was such a weird sort of job in some ways, because the Realm of Chaos books are already there. They came out in the late 80s, and they had stuff about the Horus Heresy in them, which had been touched on again in Adeptus Titanicus, but always in this kind of very peripheral. It's the thing that happened, and Horus injured the Emperor, and he ended up in the Golden Throne. And that's kind of all it's said. It's a bit more Adeptus Titanicus. So when we came to do second edition Chaos Space Marine Codex, which was the first time the Chaos Space Marines are getting any kind of a codex, we were like, well, we have all these Space Marine chapters with this great mythology about them, in effect, about Ultramarines or Blood Angels or Dark Angels. Where is that for the Chaos Space Marines, or Chaos Space Marines, guys with spikes on them? So we wanted more, and it had talked about who the traitor legions were and so forth. And it was basically take a deep dive on all of that and give them some character, channel it through the gods as well to give the gods some character, use special characters, named individuals that kind of like are paragons or exemplifiers of their particular legion or their mindset or what have you. So, World Eaters get Khan the Betrayer, who's a mad guy with a chain axe, and so on and so on, and build it out that way. And yeah, it is one of those things. I actually have awards for the Chaos Space Marine Codex. I don't have an awful lot of awards, believe it or not, despite my 30 years in service. But I have one for that. Which was surprised me at the time. It's like, oh, people really liked it.
I'm happy to hear that, because it is something that even like as the years have passed has held up a lot of people view that as like the quintessential like resource for.
Well, again, yeah, it was the it's the seed, isn't it? It's the germ for a lot of the things that came later. Yeah, because again, we worked with Bill King closely on that, and so he wrote his Horus and the Emperor, battling it out and so on, and that gave a lot of flavour to it. And yeah, it's been interesting to see how it's developed up into the full Horus Heresy, 40 or 50 different novels and all this kind of thing from those fairly humble beginnings. But I mean, credit where credit's due. That's because Rick was always good at planting seeds, narrative seeds, in his work as well, and he'd already planted those seeds in Realm of Chaos and in Rogue Trader and even in Adeptus Titanicus. So they were already there. It was just a question of growing them a bit further into something that was fit for purpose in terms of collecting armies and giving them character and saying, how is this legion different to that legion on a tabletop and things like that.
Well, this is obviously a bit of my chaos bias showing, so I wanted to ask a little bit more questions about all of that stuff. But obviously, you did a lot in terms of your career at Games Workshop, and you mentioned Necromunda, but there was so many different things you had your hands in. I know
Battlefleet Gothic. Let's get that one in there as well. I'm very
Battlefleet
proud of
Gothic. You made the Skaven Codex. You did a lot of books for 4th edition. 2nd edition was pretty much you and Jervis. So, yeah, it's something where it's like you can tell a lot of the times when it's something you touched, because you had this kind of veneer of whimsy on top of the grimdark that I didn't see in a lot of earlier publications, where it was like, I felt like there was definitely a focus on making things fun and kind of blowing things up in a way to add proportion to them. So I thought that was interesting, just kind of following that thread through, that there's definitely a theme there that I can see with a lot of things that you worked on.
Well, like I say, I was scarred as a child by games that look like they should be fun, with really interesting looking miniatures and terrain and everything that proved to be really dull. So I spent all my time trying to rectify that and create games I would want to play, on the presumption, as it proved to be the case, that other people would want to play them as well. And if there's anything, though, I spent 30 years now designing, and I still design tabletop games a lot now. Doing that, lowering the bar to entry, getting people to just play your game in the first place. That's the first thing you have to do. Second thing, you have to make sure they have fun, because otherwise they won't come back. They won't keep playing your game. Why would they? And there's other things that are more fun to do with their time. So that, but at the same time, accepting that you also need to have a fairly hard edge to it. It can't just be a game of Uno that you're playing about with. Chaos Space Marines play differently to Space Marines even, and things like that. These are important things, because when you get to tabletop games, there's a lot of investment goes on in my force, my army, my guys sort of thing, and you want to make them special. You want to make them fun, special, and different to other people, do things in different ways. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on there, I suppose, really.
And kind of when do you feel like you made your transition into writing, like actually doing full novels and authorship? Because you handled quite a bit of books in your career.
I've done a few, nowhere near as much as some of my contemporaries like Gav. I've written 5 novels, and I've done a bunch of short stories and some novellas and stuff like that. That only really kicked in after I finished at Games Workshop. I never really had the time at Games Workshop. I did a couple of short stories while I was still at Games Workshop, because Black Library, Inferno magazine always wanted short stories. And I used to write little bits of short fiction pretty often for doing codexes and 40k rule books and things like that. After Bill King had gone, I took over that to a certain extent, just as part of reading the book, because I'd seen how he did it by that point. It was like, oh, this is cool. And I encouraged other guys who were working with me on 40k to do the same thing. So we kept the thing of having levels, because for a writer, it's a horrendous coffin-shaped box that you're trying to put them in. 250 words to describe all this. I need 3 pages at least. For us, however, it was pretty straightforward. It was only once I made the transition to trying to write novels I began to understand, because it's like, yes, you want to take pages to describe things, because you've got 100,000 words to write before you get to the end of this novel, so you can't just race through everything. So yeah, it was only after I'd finished the Games Workshop that I wrote a novel. One of the first things I did actually was I wrote a Necromunda novel called Survival Instincts. And then a number of years later, I picked it up again and I did some Dark Eldar. I did the Dark Eldar trilogy, 3 different books about Dark Eldar. And I did one for Dust Warfare as well, for Paolo Parente. So that's my 5 novels. But I say I did a bunch of short stories and novellas, which are an interesting length, actually. That's really good. I'd recommend that to anybody who's starting out writing. Each of them's a bit of a different talent. A short story is very, very different to a novella, and a novella is very, very different to a novel, just in terms of the ground you're covering in them. I thought of a fantastic simile for this. I'll see if I can try and remember it. The difference between writing rules and writing a novel. That was it. Writing rules is a bit like wandering up and down on the seashore, yeah? Picking up bits of driftwood, building your sandcastle in the hopes that it can survive when the tide rolls in. Writing a novel is far more like going, there's a rock out there, I want to swim to it. And you set out swimming for the rock. And you're swimming, and you're swimming, and you're swimming, and the rock's not getting any closer. That's kind of like the difference mentally between doing the two different jobs. Yes, yeah. I'm great at wandering beachcomber jobs. I'm not great at swimming out to the rock. It takes me far too long. So that's why I don't do too many novels. But it was a really worthwhile experience, because it is a very different experience writing a full novel. You know, you have this massive canvas to fill. Off you go. You can fill it with whatever you want within certain parameters. But it's a very disciplined. Which is ironic, talking about rule writing and saying that novel writing is more disciplined, but it kind of is. Yeah. You know, to get to A to B to C and tell a story along the way that's satisfying is a hell of a skill.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. One thing I'm really curious about, just again, as a Chaos fan, you're kind of talking about this journey where you see the rock and you start heading out towards there. When you were working on, because gods like Nurgle, Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, they were there just in the Games Workshop universe before you started writing. I guess kind of the question was, because originally in fantasy, and then you were implementing them into 40K and adding all that background to them in 40K. Did you feel a little constrained by having to match like exactly how the gods operated? Or did you kind of enjoy having like, hey, these gods exist and we're not going to put them in a sci-fi setting? What was kind of the thought process there?
No, I like the fact that we had them there and so well defined, so available, because there was a lot of work had gone into the gods in Warhammer, and particularly through Warhammer Roleplay as well, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So they were really fleshed out. You know, you could read pages and pages about Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch or Slaanesh. You knew where they came from, what their shtick was, and that's great. That was having a rock along the way. To actually launch yourself off, rather than just like, well, what should we do with Chaos Gods? Oh, let's make them all wibbly wobbly, and that was never going to fly anyway. You know, not everybody, enough people had already seen the Realm of Chaos books and seen about the Chaos Gods and seen that, because they covered their interaction in 40K as well to some extent. So it was incumbent to use what was there. There were already 4 Chaos Gods, so there was no real need to expand on that. I mean, we introduced the concept of Chaos Undivided as like, you're not dedicated specifically to any of them, which was a useful trope to have, basically, for people who didn't want to be, I have to be green and pussy, do I? No. You had guys who just wanted to dress in black with studs with horns on the helmet and not have a specific dedication. That's fine. You can do that too. So yeah, it was the glory of having something pre-made to work with, and and just try and do it in a 40K fashion rather than a Warhammer fashion.
I liked actually just quick side note, I did have a question about the book stuff, but I did like how like even reading through that book, it's very clear in the design. Like on Abaddon's profile, it's like, oh, he gets this from this god, and then over here Tzeentch is giving him that, and it's just he gets his claw over here. So I thought that was fun. On the book portion and on the writing portion, what did you enjoy writing the most?
In terms of novels?
Yeah.
Probably the Dust novel, actually, Zverograd, because like I say, I was into World War II when I was like 10, 11, younger, really. It was a very big presence, and living in the UK, particularly in that period of history, you know, it was only 20 years since the war when I was born. Well, 21 years since the war when I was born. So it was very present, World War II was, and being able to, and I've already had a passion for that particular slice of history, being able to take that and work it into a weird war kind of like environment was really entertaining. I had a lot of fun with it. I did enjoy doing the Necromunda novel quite a lot as well. That was a pure kind of like, I've never written a novel before, I want to. It's not bad. It's not a great novel, frankly. I've read it again subsequently, and it was better than I thought it was, actually, to be fair. But thank you for all the people who read it and said nice things about it. It's my first novel. The Dark Elder books were different in that was more of a job of work, of like consciously getting, I'd been away from Games Workshop for a number of years when I picked up doing that, and it was like, I was freelancing and not necessarily making a lot of money at the time. I needed the money, so I engaged with doing Dark Eldar, sort of like get my head back into what was going on, which was nice, actually. To be fair, I got to work with Phil Kelly a bit, who had worked out before Games Workshop, because he'd been doing all the work on Dark Eldar for the Codex. So I got to have a bit of interaction on that, and I did have fun with that as well. But I definitely had more fun writing Zverograd and Survival Instinct.
So let's segue a little bit into kind of the next portion of your career. So you've done what you've done with Warhammer. That's helped, define your brand, and now you're moving on to working on other projects. There was a time where you went and you actually worked on the Wings of Liberty campaign for the StarCraft 2 series. So tell me a little bit about your experience there. How was this process of work different when you're working on like a video game rather than a tabletop?
Yes, I went over. I worked at Blizzard in 2005. I went over there. In many ways, it's very, very similar. And the creative process is always a matter of, there is no real right and wrong. What you're doing is sitting down in a room and deciding what right and wrong are going to be. So you still do a lot of that process, basically. Even in an existing kind of like background, an existing IP like StarCraft was, you're still making decisions on what to do with it next, just as it had been with 40K and Warhammer and things like that. Your decisions are not made in a vacuum, but they are your decisions, so you can do all kinds of different things. So a lot of that, a lot of processing through. The process is quite different. Digital games are very multifaceted compared to what I'd been used to at Games Workshop. We always used to say, you need three things for making a miniatures game. You need art, miniatures, and words. You need about 15 things for making a digital game. And each of them is their own skill set, their own talent. People can be good at it. They can be bad at it. They can make good decisions. They can make bad decisions. You will have to look at each other's decisions all the time. And see if it fits in. And only if all of these fantastical things align together, work together, work well together, and all the code holds up, do you then have a digital game. It has definitely altered my attitude towards them. I view every digital game I play as nothing less than a miracle on many levels. If it's got merit of any kind, I consider it nothing less than miraculous. Which is not to say that the people at Blizzard were bad at doing this or anything like that. They were very, very good at doing this. They were very experienced. But it is so many, the old plates on sticks where you wobble the stick and the plate stays on the top of the stick. Have you seen people do that trick? And the trick is to keep as many plates on top of sticks as possible, even as they're slowing down. You have to wobble each stick individually. Yeah, video games, like I say, goes up to having about 20 sticks instead of 3. And greatest respect for people who can do that. My little slice, I mainly worked on narrative because obviously my games design experience, all in tabletop, didn't really have much bearing in terms of making the game. Even though, God bless them, there were a lot of 40K fans there at Blizzard and things like that. So they were prepared to listen to me, which was nice of them. But yeah, I mostly did narrative design and dialogue. And learned a lot more about writing dialogue, particularly in terms of digital games, and the voice recording end of things and so forth as well, which is another dimension entirely when you get onto good voice acting, bad voice acting. It's like, oh, it makes that much difference. It sounds amazing now, and now it sounds terrible. Because there's a truism that every line of dialogue you write sounds terrible. actually it does sound terrible until you give it to someone who can, like, give that emotion, that raw emotion, get your feelings going, and then it sounds amazing, or not, as the case may be. And that's a whole mysterious process unto itself. And I've also learned a great appreciation of good voice acting, because it makes such a big difference in every game. So yes, a lot to learn there, and not much time to do it in. So I didn't last too long at Blizzard. 2005 to 2009, I was working there, but I learned a lot along the way. I made some good friends, and it was an amazing experience, but very intense. That was the other thing as well, of course, is crunch culture, which I ran into. It was kind of funny because a lot of the guys I was working with, because StarCraft was Team One, who'd been, came with the bricks sort of thing. They did Warcraft and they did StarCraft and Brood War and all this sort of stuff. So a lot of like greybeards, and they'd been, through the trenches. They'd been through their wars before now. They'd done their death march crunch of like a year and things like that before now. So for Wings of Liberty, they were like, no, we're going to be clever. We're going to pre-crunch. So way ahead of when we were actually looking at releasing, we were already there till 11 o'clock at night and things like that. It was like, oh. Which was, I was used to clocking in at 9 and knocking off at 6, basically. So that was a bit of a culture shock as well. But it was very much their culture, and they took great pains to make it a very kind of like group experience, shall we say, tribal feel, family feel. Team working together, etc. They were quite serious about it.
So slogging through a lot more hours when you're working in that digital space, sounds like.
Yeah. And one of the things you have to appreciate, things go at different speeds as well. So what I could be doing with that crunch time, not really much, frankly. But you kind of have to be there, because some people going home and other people not going home creates a lot of dissension in the ranks, as it were. So kind of.
So on that note, we've covered, I would say, a portion of your time kind of through the professional industry, going to some of these really large companies, but you also did some smaller scale stuff for companies. I know that you helped with completing projects. You're seen as kind of a fixer for a lot of smaller games. You spent some time working on Dust. You spent some time working on Drop Zone Commander. You even created your own miniature game, Blood in the Skies. Like right
Blood Red Skies.
Blood Red Skies. Blood Red Skies. Blood Red Skies. So talk to me about this portion of time.
Okay. One correction. I didn't actually work on Drop Zone Commander. I did Drop Fleet Commander. Easy mistake to make, though. I understand. I did some freelance work in between Games Workshop and working at Blizzard. That's when I wrote this Survival Instincts novel. I also wrote a Starship Troopers miniatures game for Mongoose Publishing, who got the license fairly briefly, but they got the license for a while for the movie. That was tremendous fun. First game I had worked on that wasn't a 40k game in like 14 years. And subsequent to working at Blizzard, I kind of came out of it with the feeling that although there were jobs potentially to be had working in digital, that maybe I'd be better trying to go back to doing the freelancing thing, which, I say, it was fairly thin pickings for a while, it must be said. But I did do Dust Warfare for Fantasy Flight Games, like a tabletop game version of it, because there's a board game, which is the original of it, which played on a grid. So I did like a full board game for that. And that's where it kind of spun off into that Sverigod novel as well. And it was after that I moved back to the UK, about a year after that, I think it was, and started picking up a lot of jobs actually doing tabletop stuff again. It was like people are like, "Oh, he's back." So I picked up some work from Warlord Games, doing like an army book, Armies of the Soviet Union, for their bolt action game, World War II. And again, World War II, which always works for me on some level. And I'd actually seen stuff for Drop Zone Commander. I really liked the miniatures that were done for it. And I got in touch with Hawk War Games, who were selling it, and said, "Look, I really like your stuff. Do you want me to do anything for you? Is there anything I can do for you?" And I met up with Dave Lewis, who's actually the owner, and he designed all the miniatures himself, and was a very talented man. And I met up with him, and he revealed his secret desire. That they were massive Epic fans from back in the day, so they remember me from doing Titan Legions and things like that, which to a large extent inspired the game that they were doing now. And I was like, oh, good on you guys. But they wanted to do a spaceship game as well, Drop Fleet Commander, kind of pinging off Battlefleet Gothic back in the day as well, which I was very happy to work on that for them and come up with Drop Fleet Commander. And yeah, there's been more since, more stuff with Warlord. Blood Red Skies actually is something that I still own, and I designed that back when I was in Seattle, just after leaving Blizzard, and I was starting to freelance again there, and I was having breakfast with a friend of mine, Ryan Miller, who's another games designer, and he just pitched this question to me. It was like, if you could design anything for yourself, what would you design? And it was a stunning question at first, because I hadn't thought about it in so many years, because there'd always been a brief. There's always a thing that needs designing, and part of the role of games designer is to get your head into it and understand why it's fun. Yeah, it's not a job to do. It's like fun to be had. So I hadn't really thought about that in a very long time. But even as we sat there, eating our breakfast sort of thing, I was like, oh, I'll do this, which was the germ of the idea for doing Blood Red Skies, which is a World War II. Once again, back to the font again. World War II aerial combat game, kind of based on my experiences. Just after leaving Games Workshop, I got into online gaming, which I'd never been able to do when I was at Games Workshop. Never had the time for it or the inclination, particularly. But I got into playing one called World War II Online and learned how to fly, because it's basically simulators, and began to understand a lot more about aerial warfare, which I just hadn't before now. And I was really struck with how different it was to every tabletop war game I'd ever seen that was to do with aerial warfare, because it was all about pre-plotting your moves and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. That's not what it was like at all in my experience flying in the hostile skies. It was a far more dynamic experience, fast moving, quite visceral on many, many different levels. And I wanted to design something that felt more like what I'd felt and what I tended to read about when I read kind of like Ace's biographies and things like that about what their experiences were like. So yeah, trying to be true to it. So, and that's what freelancing lets me do to a certain extent, is I can pick and choose a little bit. I can do things where I go, oh, that will be fun. I would like to, do something or say something about that style of game, rather than having to take, whatever's next on the schedule that's been laid out 7 years ago, and so on and so forth.
So being a freelancer, that's a whole other side of things. How do you go about doing that? Do you typically contacts reach out to you? I mean, you obviously have an established brand. People know you for what you've worked on. But how do you go about doing the marketing portion for yourself, getting your name out there and trying to get in touch with some of these companies?
Well, initially I really struggled with it, because I didn't appreciate that Andy Chambers was a brand in itself, and it actually meant something to people. Not in like being able to tout for work. I don't know. I should have known this, because when I got the job at Blizzard, it was basically on the strength of all the stuff I'd done at Games Workshop, and they knew me, so they gave me a job. And it's basically like that. It's once you've established a portfolio and people know your stuff, they will take an interest, especially if you tell them, hey, I'm looking for work. The example of what War Games was of just getting in touch with them and saying, like, hey, this is me, I've done this before, would you be interested in doing something with me? It's cold calling at the end of the day, but sometimes that stuff, the longer it's gone on, I've been freelancing now for more than 10 years, and people tend to find their way to me. There's also a number of other freelancers that I work with on occasion, for one reason or another, and we tend to bat things between ourselves of like, I'm too busy, I can't do this, will you do it? Or could you do it? Or can you point me to somebody who does? So that there's kind of like a little informal network that builds up. So one of my clients at the moment, yeah. So for example, I've got 2 clients at the moment, more than 2 actually. There's 2 very active ones at the moment. One of those is a job that Ryan Miller passed on to me, which he'd taken on, but he was getting a different job, a full-time job. He works at Ravensburger now. which is more what he wanted to do because he wasn't very happy doing freelancing. So he passed along this other job that he was doing to me to take over, which he'd done a core set of rules for, but it still needs development, sort of thing. I've done that so many times by now. Yes, I have done, game doctory type stuff pretty much all the way through, really, almost 30 years. So it's got no hesitation for me on doing things like that. The other client, however, is somebody that literally contacted me on LinkedIn. I have a profile on LinkedIn. They send me a message on LinkedIn sort of saying, blah, we're interested in doing this and that. And I responded to them. Then they went quiet for 6 months. And I was like, well, there you go. And then they came back to me randomly. I was like, oh, you guys, okay. And what they're doing is quite interesting as well. And, I'm spending a bit of time doing work with them. So that's a couple of examples. Meanwhile, Blood Red Skies is like an ongoing concern for me. So I work with Warlord on that fairly regularly for like new releases and stuff like that. And because of my long association with Warlord, because Warlord's nearly all X Games Workshop old farts like me, basically. I can get work off them pretty much any time I want to. I've been working specifically with them on a series of games based on 2000 AD comics. Because again, I used to read it on the playground when I was young. I read it to this day. I still have a subscription to that comic. So it's just a great pleasure to be able to do tabletop games like I always thought about, comic strips I read and enjoy. So that's really good stuff. And these are the, excuse me, these are the benefits that you get out of freelancing. I'm in a happy spot. I was very poor for a while, it must be said. Like I say, writing Dark Eldar books and taking too long about it and earning virtually no money. So fortunately, my wife had a job at the time who could support us because I wasn't doing. But it's a lot better now. The world has become easier for freelancing overall because of the internet and connectivity. The last 2 years of lockdowns and partial lockdowns and stuff like that have spurred it even further. There's so many people that are entirely comfortable with people remote working now, especially for this kind of work, that it's a pretty open field. And of course, gaming's got much, much bigger over the years since I started. I've seen statistics like gaming makes more money than movies and music. These days, it's a bigger industry overall. And admittedly, that's including all your digital games, which is where the bulk of the money is. But it also does include tabletop and board games and card games and all that shtick. There's a lot of it. It's only grown over my lifetime and will continue to do so, I think, because it is the superior form of entertainment.
Sure. No, that makes complete sense. I guess, Andy, one thing I'm really curious about is, as a freelancer, when you come in on a project, there's going to be pre-established ideas, pre-established game mechanics, pre-established visions of how it's going to play out. I guess when you're coming in, when you're familiarizing yourself with a game or thinking, okay, here's things I'm going to change or improve, what's that process like? Do you play the game a lot? Do you talk to the designers? What's kind of your main focus for how to approach a new game?
No, you start off by reading it, because that's what your customers will do, inevitably. You can learn a lot by reading a set of rules before somebody plays it with you. It'll be inaccurate for certain. To be fair, it depends on how far advanced it is. If it's at a stage where it's a bunch of notes, then you need to play it with the guy who's trying to design it so that they can communicate what they're trying to do with it. If it's been written up, then you take what's been written up and take scissors to it, basically. I talked at the start about how games design is more art than science, about feel and stuff like that. Read through pretty much any document, any rules document, and you'll get a feel for what feels smooth, what feels rough, where the sharp corners are, things like that. And you look for the sharp corners, try and round them off. Ironically, sometimes you actually need to add roughness to things. You need to add granularity, as we call it, because it helps people get a grip on things. Sometimes a system just sort of like skates past a subject that's actually quite core and could be a lot of fun, and you need to actually expand it out. More often, you need to trim everything back down again, because what we tend to do is we come up with a good core basic idea, develop it some, becomes a better idea. That's cool. Keep developing, keep developing, keep developing, keep developing. Now it's an overgrown mess. So you need to like trim it back a bit and go. And in that time, the core of the game may have shifted from one point to another, and that's cool. But you still need to find the core, as it were, and get past all the external stuff that gets you away from being at the core as quickly as possible. I do like to cite Blood Red Skies as probably the best game I've ever designed, because it's really, really good at that. I can teach you that game in 5 minutes, less, but it will, and it's a very, very simple game, but it will take you a very long time to master it. Not because it's difficult, but because there's a lot of nuance to it, despite it being simple, or perhaps because it's simple. So yeah, it tells you a lot how easy it is to teach it to somebody else as well. You know,
Sure.
do I have to stand here giving you a half-hour explanation of this works, how this works, or can I tell you a few basics and get you into the game and get you rolling dice and da-da-da? That's a very key factor to have for tabletop games and board games to a certain extent as well. I hate things that take like half an hour to set up and then another half an hour of having the rules explained to you. You need to be able to get going. So yeah, with an established set, it's kind of easier because you haven't had to do that legwork already. It's established there, and you can come to it as a third party and observe and go like, all right. On things you do yourself, you get blind spots. You get things you like a lot. You hang on to them and try and keep them in the game. Like, oh, I've written it up now. I may as well keep it in, sort of thing. It's like, no, chop it out.
I like that
out.
idea of taking all the concepts and putting them into a big pile and then finding the ones that you really want. It's like you're making the haystack before you have to look for the needles in it. And I think that's pretty interesting. So this is the last little portion I want to touch on here, which is maybe the most interesting and also the hardest to talk about. I want to talk about the successes, the failures, and what you learned from it. So first of all, sounds like you're already touching off with what you think is one of your greatest design successes in Blood Red Skies.
Yes.
And you've already touched a little bit on why you think that is a success. It represents like a lot of the philosophies that you've kind of developed over the years. It's a game that's easy to pick up and play, but takes a lot of depth, and there's a lot to master. And I do like hearing about that philosophy. Is there anything else you want to add there in terms of like things that you think make that one particularly important for you as a success for your career?
It's a very clever sort of a game, because I say on the surface it's dead simple, but it actually does a pretty good job of representing history and historic differences between aircraft and stuff like that. So your Spitfires do play very differently to your Messerschmitt 109s or your P-47 Thunderbolts or what have you. Each plane is kind of unique, but it's operating off a really small stat line, which is, like I say, where the cleverness comes in. It's got a card system to it, which allows for like a bit of meta, like weather and external factors as well, and it's quite tidy on that front. And like I say, it's something where it's very easy to get into it, and once you start playing it, you can see it when people are playing it. Their brain starts to expand at a certain point and go like, that means I could do that, and I have ideas for tactics now. You can see it happen, and that usually takes a lot longer. You can see it happen in other games too, and so forth. But I've never designed a game where I saw it happen as quickly as it happens with Blood Red Skies, which is perfect, because I say I wanted something that was fast playing and visceral, but with a cleverness to it as well, about tactical gameplay and luck as well. Luck comes into it too. So I think the simplicity of the system is what I've learned. It has great value, but the fact that you also want some granularity to it so that you can show differences, like I touched on earlier, about why this plays different to that, why this is advantageous over that, within a system that's very simple. And I'm really very proud of the way that Blood Red Skies does that. Great little community as well, which is one of the reasons I like it so much. Is I talk to the community a lot, and they tell me how I'm getting it wrong and stuff like that.
And I do like
with a historical subject, you need some of that. Sorry,
sure.
Take it.
I do like the card system, and hopefully no virus bombs in this one.
No, we're lessons learned. It kind of had its own when I first designed it. It had a couple of mini virus bombs in it as well. But you have to take risks. You have to take some risks. You have to push the envelope a little bit, because otherwise, oh, this one gives me +1 to hit. Okay, that's a bit dull, isn't it? This one blows up something far more interesting. Actually, a good example of that are those 2000 AD games that I mentioned with Warlord, because they are zany at times, because they're operating off comic strips, and obviously the narrative that gets played out in a comic strip, gun battle or what have you, can be ended very abruptly. 2000 AD specializes in this. There's a number of characters who, like, whip out. Yeah, Judge Dredd whips out his lawgiver and shouts "High X" and blows up whatever the bad guy is. Doesn't matter if it's a tank or it's a robot or if it's a dude or what. High X. Pff, end of prog. That's the end of the issue. Thank you. And allowing for that kind of like gameplay in the narrative of gameplay has been interesting. Our cards was the answer to that one too. Better example in some way. There's another strip called Strontium Dog, which is about bounty hunters, and one of their favored weapons is the time bomb, which will actually seal somebody in a little stasis blob of time, and like until the planet has moved on, and then they reappear in the vacuum of space. Haha, hilarious. So having time bombs in the game, it was vortex grenades all over again. But there is a value in that. It keeps games very, very honest in a way. Like, you pile all your points into this one uber character that can do everything, and like, oh, vortex grenade, oh, time bomb, what have you, they're gone. It teaches you to spread out a bit in terms of where your emphasis is put. But anyway, that wasn't the question you were asking me at all. I told you I'll get into anecdotes.
That touched a little bit on like emergent gameplay, that sometimes things are designed and it doesn't interact exactly the way you thought it would, but maybe it does something important.
Yes.
But like that's the idea of like as success in the tabletop side of your career. What about for your career in general? What do you think your biggest successes are for you?
Highlights of my career in general, actually having one for this long, where I've been able to work professionally in something I love, is the biggest success out of all of them, really, despite all the odds at times, and being able to work with some really great people over the years, like genuinely creative, wonderful people who I have had the pleasure of learning a lot from. And I'm looking forward. We're actually getting together for the first time in years for curry next week. Me and Jervis and Jez and all as old farts. So there's been that. It's been great opportunities. Personal successes have been great opportunities to travel and things like that. Within all of it, I've done a lot of games. I'm very proud of most of them, actually. Some ones stand out in particular. Blood Red Skies, say, is the current one. Battlefleet Gothic always stands out for me, as that I had such a good time writing that game. It turned out really, really well, is well remembered even now. Actually, all of them are, to some extent, to my surprise. Necromunda as well, that really hit the spot, as it were, when it came to just being a nice package of everything like that. But like I say, I've enjoyed virtually all of the games I've worked on some level. Some have met with great commercial success, some haven't. Even the ones that don't, you learn something from those as well, like don't do it again and things like that. So, and I've kind of had the privilege of being able to do that as well, of having successes and failures and learning from them, which is not everybody gets to claim that, I guess.
So let's talk a little bit about the challenges and the failures. We can start with the tabletop or your career, whichever you'd prefer, and just talk me through some of those things. What did you learn from them too?
What I consider the biggest failure of my career is the Epic 40,000 relaunch. After we did Titan Legions, we did Epic 40,000. Changed the system a lot. Too much, as it turned out. Me and Joyce worked really intensely on Epic 40,000, and it's a lovely system. It's a lovely game. It's got simplicity and complexity and all those good things that we talked about earlier on. It ticks a lot of those boxes. In some ways, it was a bit too ahead of its time. Like, I see people writing about it now and going like, oh, well, this was genius for back in the day. So it was a little bit too advanced. We got too far up our own arses. Games design is what it came down to, and didn't address what the players would actually want. So when it launched, the feedback we got from that was that the take-up was pretty poor. A lot of people weren't very happy with it. It was like, oh. Because, of course, they had at this point been playing 2 editions of Space Marine, plus a load of supplements that I had written myself, and Titan Legions had come out, all using the same core system. and all playing the game a certain way. And we, totally threw that out and gave them, a new and better way to play where they could build their own detachments however they liked and all that sort of thing. They didn't want that. They never asked for that, and they didn't want it. So when it landed, despite it being, technically a very fine piece of games design, it didn't take off at all, and it effectively killed Epic for Games Workshop, who'd always been a bit kind of like, well, we keep it around, but actually we just want to sell you 40k figures more than anything else. So it was kind of a death knell for Epic for a while until, well, that's Titanicus recently when they started bringing back that scale again. So yeah, that was my dreadful failure. Hubris was responsible for it. I'd like to say I learned from that overall to be more sensitive to, particularly when you're doing the 3rd or 4th edition. I mean, people can then roast me for 3rd edition 40k being completely different to 2nd edition 40k too. But that wasn't quite the same. I don't know. It kind of had to happen in terms of 2nd edition to 3rd edition because of the way things were growing. It was just getting to be unplayable every time, and we needed to zero things down a bit. And we didn't change it that much in comparison to what we did with Epic 40,000. That was a far more kind of like year zero. If we had a blank slate, what would we do now? That was the way we approached it, and it wasn't the right way to do it. So that was the biggest failure. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, is there any projects you hopped on, maybe during your Games Workshop period or later on, that just kind of fell apart after you joined it, or what do you think you learned from those when things just kind of didn't quite come together?
Oof. I don't know. You don't tend to try and remember those ones. For one thing, they don't tend to see the light of day. I've done a lot of work for different digital companies while being freelancing, for example. I've written a lot of words that will never see the light of day because the company went bust, the game didn't get made, or whatever. So I think there's some of that. Don't be too precious about what you do because it may not go anywhere one day. Doesn't particularly concern me as long as I get paid, frankly. But that's because I have the privilege of being in a position where it's like I've had loads of things published before. It's no skin off my nose if I don't publish more things now. When you're trying to establish that portfolio, that sort of thing, not good. You get a sense. I talked about the plate wobbling sticks earlier on. You do get a sense for projects when things aren't. When there's this smash plates all over the floor and there's more falling all the time. Projects primarily are about people and whether people can work together and work well together. If you get a sense when you're working on the project that people don't work well together, then it's probably not going anywhere. Or if it's going somewhere, then what you're going to get is not going to be very good. Is my guideline for that.
When you mishapped and accidentally destroyed Epic, I'm assuming there was a lot of maybe negative feedback from the community, maybe in response to those rules or just as a general reception. And it sounds like that's kind of where your focus was overall the community didn't like the product.
Yes.
How is it that you handle those kinds of concerns? I mean, especially early on in your career, like example with the virus bomb as well. When people don't like something you do, how do you avoid like resetting, get your mentality right in pushing through to make something better? Because I feel like a lot of people will start a project and then they'll receive maybe some negative feedback and then feel discouraged.
Ego is the answer to that. You have to have enough ego to go, no, damn you, you're all wrong. My conclusions about Epic 40,000 are something that I drew well after the event. I mean, we heard a bit of opprobrium coming up when it was released, but I don't know, particularly when I was at Games Workshop, again, we're talking mid-90s, early 90s. So, there wasn't internet around. We didn't necessarily pay an awful lot of attention to it, in part because it was just full of people being mean. So why would you listen to that?
Still is.
It still is to this day. That is still true. Absolutely. But I don't know. there was a different tone that we expected to hear from feedback and things like that. So we didn't give it too much credit at the time. So it was only kind of like in subsequent years that I put together where we'd gone wrong with it, not in the immediate aftermath. And there was no change in course at that point either, because, you know, thousands of boxes have been printed and distributed all over the world. You can't wave a magic wand and pull it back.
Yeah,
you can just hope that it lands well.
I think it's tough, especially for people that are kind of new to this space, where they have to balance like just having a thick skin and being confident in what they created, and also like listening to legitimate feedback from your community.
Again, it's walking that narrow line again, because too much of a thick skin and you're just not listening. You're not taking on board what people are telling you, and that's not good. Too little of a thick skin and you just pushed every which way by every thought or criticism that comes out of anybody's mouth. At that point, you're not a games designer. You're just a scribe for other people's ideas, and that's not what you got into it for, probably, I would imagine. And those ideas probably aren't good ones. You know, being a games designer comes with having enough ego to say, no, I think this is right. This is the right way of doing things. That means you're going to have to stand up for what you think is right as on occasion. And sometimes you're going to have to admit that I was wrong. We should do it a different way. All of the above are true. Very Zen, basically.
And I guess my last question on this portion is just how do you manage the burnout? Because you're moving through a lot of different companies. There's a lot of expectations put on you, especially early portion of your career, working for Games Workshop. You work for Blizzard. How do you manage not getting burnt out in that space? Or if you do get burnt out, how is it that you work yourself back from that? What's your solution?
My initial response is I don't get burned out because I'm doing what I love, but that's not true. That's not true. I do get burned out. Take some space occasionally. You know, give yourself some time away from it is one key. I don't do an awful lot of tabletop gaming for fun these days, it must be said. What I do for fun is I tend to play console games because I'm comfortably not working on console games, so I can just enjoy them. So I think that's part of it. Don't take it so seriously that you don't, you know, make time to have fun for yourself, doing whatever you want to do, not just something that helps your work, as it were. Don't take on jobs you don't like is one of the biggest ones. You can do it. You can grind through. It does take something out of the tank to do that. So if you must take on jobs that you don't like, try and make sure you have some fun ones to do either at the same time or to look forward to immediately afterwards, so that you have a goal to aim for rather than just a daily grind, because that's no fun at all. One of the reasons I like freelancing is because it helps avoid burnout, because you're doing different things, working on different IPs, different games, and so on. 14 years working in the same studio on the game system, same game systems, could be tough on that front at times. But in the case of Games Workshop, we were always kind of building something more, progressing forward. So the things I didn't like about that environment was when it came to doing, Space Marine Codex for the 4th time or 5th time or something like that. That sort of thing burns me out. I think it would burn anybody out given time. So try and avoid being in that situation if you can. But like I say, it's a privilege to be able to say that in the first place. You may be in that situation. So just find things about it that you love. Go back to what I said right at the start, which is part of a game designer's job is to find things about it that you love, because you're trying to get other people to love it too. And if you don't love it, how can you expect anyone else to?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And talking about things people love, as a tabletop gamer, having met many myself, people love complaining about dice. They love complaining about card draws. I want to kind of get your thoughts on the role of luck in a game, because it's one of those things where there's like a spectrum. Like some games like chess, there's no luck at all. And then other games like say blackjack or something, it's basically all luck. How do you balance having an element of luck in there to keep things interesting and give everyone a chance, versus maybe adding too much luck and then everyone feels it's out of their control? What's kind of your mindset towards adding luck element to the game?
Again, to a certain extent, it depends on the game and the audience it's for, how much luck they will accept. Yeah. 2000 AD games that I'm talking about, Strontium Dog, Judge Dredd, they're comic book games. People don't mind so much if things twist on a, that things can suddenly twist from one way into another. If I'm playing historical 15 mil, DBM or DBMM rules or something like that, something's very serious, I don't expect those sudden twists of fate to happen. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a guide about how much luck you're allowed to put into the game in terms of factors. Expectation to a certain extent. What else can you say about luck and chance? You need some of it, in my opinion. Or if you're making a game that without it, you're making a slightly different sort of a game. More of the sort of like the board gamey chess approach to things, where nothing happens without you making it happen. Everything is fully under control. That's a particular mindset of game playing, which I understand that people enjoy that. I don't particularly enjoy that myself. So the idea of taking a chance, taking a risk, then becomes implicit in the kind of games design you're doing. And then it comes down to that kind of risk versus reward trade-off. If things are too risky, people never do them. If they're too rewarding, people do them all the time. Just on the offhand chance. So again, you've got to strike a balance. And a lot of the skill comes in of like, how much do you let players manage that factor of like, how risky is it to do this? How rewarding is it to do this? So they can try and make a judgment on whether to commit to doing that or not. And at that point, it comes down to the player of how risk averse they are, or how much they just enjoy doing things for the hell of it, see what the dice roll. Because some players are like that. Some players are very, very like, no, I will control everything I possibly can. Others don't give a crap. They just want stuff to happen. So finding the sort of happy place between those two. Again, I'm going to go back to Blood Red Skies again as my primary example of my magnificent octopus of games design. In that, there's the idea of, we don't track like the height of individual planes at all. In that, all you care about is planes can either be advantaged, neutral, or disadvantaged. All right. Planes can only be shot down if they're disadvantaged. When you shoot somebody, if they're not already disadvantaged, all it might make them do is lose an advantage level. So you're trying to get them down to being disadvantaged and then shoot them again, sort of thing. Okay, so being advantaged, obviously great. Everybody wants to be advantaged. You're most well protected there. However, you can trade your advantage to get better maneuvering. You can like burn a level of advantage so you can dive and like move faster, or so that you can maneuver really hard, so that you can turn really sharply. Powerful ability, can get you on people's tails and stuff like that. But the fact that there's a trade-off there, you're giving up some of your security for more capability. That's a brilliant example of how you can get people to manage luck, manage chance going on. How much of a chance do they want to take? Obviously, if they're completely risk averse, then you never burn advantage ever. But that makes you very, very predictable when you're flying. That in itself can cause problems because it's a positional game as well, and so on and so on. So there's stuff you can do. Other games can be really zany,
Yeah.
Again, I'm thinking about those 2000 AD games, and they really do turn on the roll of the dice and so on, because the intrinsic to those, there's a system whereby you basically pull chits out of a bag to see who can activate. When like a powerful character activates, what they can do is they can try and go for it, which means they can make a cool test, and if they pass it, their chip goes back in the bag. Their turn is not over. So you get the Judge Dredd or Johnny Alpha or what have you, can do multiple things over the course of the turn, potentially, take down several bad guys at once, and it helps to resolve that. How do I get, one hard character versus a room full of people, and he can still come out on top without just relying on mad stats to make that happen? That's another example of like managing your risk. Do you want to take the risk? Because if you fail that test, actually it's detrimental. You suffer a slight detriment on your next activation, which won't be anytime soon because you failed the test. So again, it's a case where you can manage that. I mean, a more practical example is like leaving cover to close the range in a 40k game. Do you stay in cover, get the benefits of cover? Do you close the range so you can do more damage? These are all judgments that the player is expected to make, and you as designer have built them in there into the system, so there are rewards and there are risks towards each different approach, in conjunction with chance. Because you might leave cover, get closer, roll your dice, whiff really badly, you did it for nothing. It might really pay off. That comes down to the chance part, and that depends to a certain extent on how lucky players feel that they are.
That makes complete sense.
So, I mean, we've covered pretty much the successes, the failures, the majority of your career. Is there anything else you want to add? You think we didn't touch on?
Yeah, let me see. I think I'll return to a point I made earlier on, that if you're interested in games, passionate about games design, do it. Don't imagine that you have to learn a lot before starting. If you already play games, you have an opinion. Don't be afraid to exercise it and write your own games or make changes to the games you've got. It's always something we talked about at Games Workshop, and I would emphasize it to this day. These games are yours to play with. Do play with them. Don't feel like there is some science behind what's going on, because there isn't. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all manipulating numbers. Yeah, we can muck around with probability and things like that, so this becomes more likely to happen, that becomes more likely to happen. But ultimately, it's about the feel of the game. And if you don't feel your game is doing the right thing, don't hesitate to change things and write your own games, write your own subsystems, homebrew stuff. I'm delighted by the way that seems to have taken off in the world, because we have a community to actually communicate ideas like that between yourselves. So take advantage of that. It's something I never had. In some ways, it makes it harder as well, of course, because the loudest voices shout loudest and all the rest of it. But as a tool for trying out ideas and exchanging ideas and having fun with it, then it's beyond compare, really.